Make it official. All right, we're recording. Hello. How's everyone? I hope you had a good weekend. Oh, it's dark in my house, isn't it? I just noticed. So, I graded stuff and here are my thoughts. Um, are you guys listening, by the way? Like, give me a thumbs up or just type yes into the chat.
Yes.
Okay, I got a yes. Oh yeah, you could say stuff too. Okay, here's the reason I'm asking. Okay. Because when you guys like this last guys, the last answer, I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but the last answer, I literally told you exactly what to write. I did. I told you page numbers. I said include statistics. I mean, I told you exactly what to write. I did. I did. And then I'm looking at your answers, and some of them are fine. Don't take it the wrong way. Some of them are fine, but some of them, it's like you went online to some weird sources. You didn't. You just said slavery was bad, but Southerners were racist. It's like no, no. If I'm telling you what to write in the answer, do that, please. It makes me think that maybe you're not paying attention during the very exciting class lecture. Okay. So I try to tell you, when we talk about the weekly question, and for those of you that maybe don't pay close attention, I can't imagine who that might be. But for those of you that don't pay close attention, you'll know that point in the lecture because usually I put the weekly question on the screen, I share it. So when you see the weekly question on the screen, that's when you may want to pay a little closer attention. Or maybe when you're looking at the recording, because you didn't pay super close attention during class, when you see the weekly question pop up on the screen, maybe that's when you turn the volume up. I don't know what to tell you, but it is odd to me that, I'll tell you what to put in the answer, and you have a textbook and you don't listen to me and you don't use the textbook. And I'm telling you, whether you like the textbook or not, if I like the textbook and I'm the professor, you should probably get to know the textbook just a little. I mean, you don't have to hang out, be best friends, but if I told you, like, look on these pages for the answer, look on those pages for the answer. If I said, be sure to include some information from the really good graphs and charts in this section of the book, you should do that. I'm just saying. I mean, you don't have to, clearly, it's the United States. You can do whatever you like. But I'm telling you, if I'm your professor and I'm telling you I'd like for you to do something a certain way, you probably shouldn't just say like, crazy old woman, and blow me off, because well, I'm the person who also grades your work. So just saying. Okay. All right. I know. Lecture about that is over. All right. Let's look at the weekly question. All right. To what extent was Theodore Weld's argument about the sinfulness of slavery not only radical, but also necessary for the popularization of immediate abolition? Be sure to discuss the views of other abolitionists in your answer. I know you're thinking, is this really another question about abolition? It is, because it's kind of a big thing during this time period, slavery, abolition, that kind of stuff. Now, when we talk about this, is probably going to be a little bit more second half or second lecture this week. But if you're one of those folks that likes to get started early, and I know some of you are, what we're going to look at for your answer is probably around page 450. So where it starts the crusade against slavery. And also, I had somebody email and say, like, I really couldn't find anything about this person. And you said we should include this person. I think maybe it was something about Frederick Douglass or something. I can't remember. It wasn't Frederick Douglass. It was something else. I can't remember. But I told him, index. Use the index of the book, because the index of the book will tell you what page to find stuff on. So the Theodore Weld person in particular is discussed on 454. So we've got 450 to about 456 for the answer on this. 450 to 456. I think I'll write that down so I don't forget. I'm throwing stuff on the floor. So 450 to 456. You should write it down too for question 12. Yeah, that'll be good. Did I pick up what I threw in the floor? No, because I'll just knock it off again, won't I? All right. Did I let in the last person who was coming in? Ooh, I don't know. I might have kicked them out. Crud. Nope, they're in. That's good. All right. So weekly question 450 to 454. And again, we probably will not talk about it today. Not that, you know, I want to keep secrets from you, but we'll probably talk about the first half of the chapter. I'm going to type this in. I'm worried about you guys from last week. So I'm going to type this in the chat. Oh, I said 56 for the weekly question. You can do, excuse me, you can do this. I have so many allergies from my trip. I don't know. I guess every place has allergies. All right, let's look at the notes. Let's see if I put the right notes up. I think I did. Dang. Okay. I just want to tell you, I don't know if you ever think about crazy stuff that happened in the United States. Do you ever think about crazy stuff that happened in the United States? To me, some of the crazy stuff that happened in the United States happened in the late 1960s. And I have a vague memory of these things because I was born in 66. So I remember stuff like the lunar landing and my parents wearing some really strange clothes. Trust me on this. But my parents were super conservative, so they weren't doing like, hey, let's go to Woodstock, or, you know, the government made this LSD, so we should try it out. My parents were not those people at all. But 1830s, dang, there's some weird stuff going down in the United States in the 1830s. So this chapter talks about some of those weird reform movements, and you'll see several of those in the quiz, but it also talks about abolition as a movement. Sorry, I'm turning the pages in my book. You're wondering, why is she going to attack the screen? No. All right, so first half of the chapter is about some odd stuff, plus some not so odd stuff. I think we have some relatively normal stuff. And then, excuse me, slavery stuff. So we'll probably save the slavery stuff and the women's rights stuff for next time. And we'll talk about the odd stuff going on during this time. Okay, so there's a religious revival going on throughout the United States called the Second Great Awakening. It really kind of peaks in the 20s and 30s, but kind of extends to the 40s and maybe started a little earlier. A lot of those revivals happen in upstate New York, which is a section of the state that they sometimes refer to as the burned over district, because there are revivals consistently. So it caught fire spiritually. They didn't go, you know, it wasn't like Bastrop or anything, or crud, my neighborhood, or that neighborhood. You guys had a neighborhood too that caught fire several years ago. Steiner Ranch, yeah, okay. But it didn't literally catch fire, it spiritually caught fire. That's also the region of the country where Joseph Smith lived. So, I mean, this is the big reform, revival kind of area of the country. All right, so Second Great Awakening, really profound religious revival. And a lot of it is about personalizing Christianity. How do you take your Christian faith, put it into action? The big theological thing that happens in Second Great Awakening is the movement away from predestination and toward free will. Yeah. And you're going like, woohoo. Okay, so predestination is the idea that God chose you. So you have to figure out if God chose you, and it's probably by how you feel when you go to church, that sort of thing. Free will is that you choose God by accepting salvation, sacrifice of Christ, that sort of thing, and then you go on and live the rest of your life in service to Christ, that sort of thing. So, so free will, you choose. Predestination, it's predetermined whether you're going to heaven or not. So Historians like to write about the Second Great Awakening because they think it goes along with the further democratization of the area, because now, or the era, excuse me, because now even religion is democratized. So, which is an interesting way to think of it. And they also like to reflect on the idea that this idea of practical applications of Christianity turns into these large number of reform movements, and then a couple of kind of odd societies. Okay, so important reforms that come because of this. Prohibition, which is my favorite reform, where they get rid of alcohol, mostly because I don't really drink to speak of, so I could care less, but I recognize it. It's a dumb reform. Prison and asylum reforms. Prison and asylums during this time period were really to punish people. So the idea of prison and asylum reform was to actually reform people or to help them reflect on the difficulties that they face, that sort of thing, which sometimes meant isolation, and that sort of drove them crazy. But they'll end up revising some of those ideas, because putting somebody in an asylum and making them worse is probably not good. Anti-prostitution campaigns. I know some of you may be like, did they really? They've always had prostitution. And because what you see is an increase in urbanization, you're seeing more people recognize the things that were probably around, but when the population became more dense. So you see more drunk people. There may not be more drunk people, but you see them more often because you all live close together. And you live closer to the prison and asylum, or it feels like more people are going because you're in the city. And again, your population's denser. And prostitution, I don't know how country prostitutes work, but in the city, they're probably more visible. And the most prominent reform of all is abolition. And since many of the cities really form in the north, you'll see a lot of abolition around certain cities, abolition movement. Chicago and Boston and New York, other cities as well. Philadelphia, yeah. All right. These moral issues are considered sins that need to be corrected by both individuals and within society. And for a variety of reasons, people believe that the second coming of Christ had already come, and that it was time to set up the community of heaven on earth. I'm not really in charge of why people think the second coming of Christ is coming in a certain year or had already come. I know there were lots of people who thought it would come the night that we went from 1999 to 2020. There were a variety of people who thought the world would end. I think it was in 2012. I think they even had movies about it. So we just have these years where people think, this is it. And there were several religious groups that predicted specific years that Christ would return. And, if he did, their thought was time to set up heaven on earth. And I don't know how they would verify that it had happened or hadn't happened, but, yeah, but I don't know that that's a historical question. All right, so some of these communities that develop that believe the second coming of Christ had already occurred will rearrange society in unusual ways. Yes, we're going to talk about a couple of those in a minute. Shakers in Oneida believe that men and women were equal in this kingdom. They do express their beliefs in very different ways. I know when I taught high school AP US history, this lesson is the only lesson my students consistently remembered. Every once in a while, I'd see one of them like 10 years later, and they go, hey, remember that time you talked about the Oneida Colony? It's like, yeah, I'm glad that's what you gathered from my class. So if you're paying attention, Oneida Colony probably will stick with you. Now, I think, yep, the links looks like they still are live. So Shakers, that's the community all your parents want you to join, at least until you get married. Shakers are celibate. And if you're like, what does that mean? That means no sex. And I'm not talking no sex until you get married. That means no sex. Yeah, they believed that evil entered the world through sexual activity. Now, if you're wondering why they believe that, me too. Or I'm the history teacher, so I have an idea. So here's the idea. Their founder, a woman named Mary Lee, had a bunch of kids, 3 or 4, that died really young. Now, during that era, the kids dying before they were 2 was unfortunately quite common. About 25% of people's kids died before they were, could completely walk and talk. And then I think another like 15% died before they were 20. So child mortality, living to be an adult, was pretty iffy back in these days because it's a dangerous time. Plus, there's no medication that works well. So, and if they have medical practices, they usually make things worse. So it's just a dangerous time, and no good medical care or dangerous medical care. So after several of her kids died, she was like super depressed, as you should be. And she believed that she had a vision from God while she was in prison. If I remember correctly, I haven't read about Mary Lee in a while, but if I remember correctly, she went to jail for disturbing the peace, because women hardly ever went to jail because they didn't have rights. That was the only bonus of not having rights. It's just also hard to go to jail. But if I recall, she went to jail for disturbing the peace because she prayed too loudly. How loud are you praying that you're disturbing the peace? But I guess the neighbors, maybe her husband, somebody needed a break. So they put her in jail. And that's where she got the vision that she was the female incarnation of Christ. Now, if you ever get a vision that you're the female incarnation of Christ, I would probably, suggest that you go seek some care. However, and I'm not denying religious faith, believe me, I'm not denying it, but that's an unusual vision. But she developed a religion around it and got followers, and mostly women, as you can imagine, or older dudes. I can't remember oh gosh, I should have looked this up before, but there's this really funny picture that is typically, if you see it, it's in textbooks. I don't think it's in yours though, which is sad. But there's this lithograph kind of drawing of Shakers, and the reason it's the really common illustration, but all the Shakers are really kind of unusual looking. That's going to be my nice euphemism for not attractive. And the reason that they made this drawing was to show that the reason people joined the Shakers is because they probably were going to be celibate anyway. However, the person who made the drawing, was making fun of the Shakers, but people who make the textbooks, I guess, didn't completely realize that. So they almost always put that drawing in if there's an illustration about Shakers, which is really funny. I'll have to find that, maybe send you an email link, because I know now you really want to see it, right? Maybe. Okay, I'm going to make a note to myself. Shaker drawing. All right. And then you'll get the choice whether you look it up. Okay, so celibacy is their main belief, and part of the reason that they wanted to be celibate is because they thought that if you had children, that would become a bridge to inequality for women. And if you're thinking, how do children lead to inequality for women? This was their thought. If the kid needs care, if the kid is sick, if something goes wrong with the kid, if nothing goes wrong with the kid and the kid needs to be fed or clothed or taken care of in any normal way, the person who does that is the mother, not the father. So then the mother can't pursue knowledge, a career, that sort of stuff, because she's got to take care of the kid. Not that she hates taking care of kids, none of that, but that when you have children, an unequal burden falls to the mother. So their thought was, not only does sin enter the world through sex, but children do as well, which they did not believe were sins. And it's also a sign that most people convert into this community. But they did think that if there weren't any children, then the women would have a greater chance at equality. They did think that. Okay, and did I mention that they were from England? Did I? Yeah. Okay, so they move over from England and establish a colony in the United States. So sorry for the yawn. All right, so they believe in celibacy, complete equality between men and women, pacifism. So pacifism is where you don't fight. So it's easy to pick on the Shakers. If you nobody picks on the Shakers except the one guy that drew those pictures. And communal rural living to avoid the corruption of city life. And I'm sure you understand that. Yeah, because the city is where you have the bars and the prostitutes and all the things we're trying to reform. So things are healthier and safer in the country. Of course they are. So they also believe in simplicity, so not too many possessions. And they also like to make furniture that had multiple uses. So like they would have a chair that turned into a ladder, or a table that folded in, if you moved it, turned into a bench or something like that. So they made the kind of furniture that was really super high quality, so it would last forever. I know some of you are going like, you just said they didn't live very long, but you know, you could pass it down from generation to generation. And apparently, I don't own anything like this, but Shaker furniture or Shaker style furniture is still pretty trendy in certain circles, even to this day, and it's really expensive. So they believed in simplicity and made a living by selling craft furniture and other multi-purpose items. And they are sometimes seen as anti-national because they're pacifists, so they always opposed war efforts. So Shakers, fairly isolated community, primarily women, lived communally in the country. Celibacy is probably the main distinguishing feature because there are not going to be any other groups that are celibate throughout their entire lives. Because of that, people tend to convert into this because, you know, if you're in it, you're celibate, so they're not raising their kids in it because they don't have any kids. The typical person who joined the Shakers was a woman, either dating age like 18 to 25, or past, you know, probably a widow past the years where she'd raised her children. So older women or younger women. And if you're wondering, why did younger women join this? It's my theory, really just to get a break from dudes. No offense, dudes, but you know, that's probably the time period 18 to 25 where guys are really interested in you. And I think sometimes the women's like, I need a break from that. I think I'll go be a Shaker for a while. A lot of times the younger women didn't stay in the community, but the older ones tended to. So it does tend to be an older woman community, although the second leader was a guy. So it's not that they were without men. And they did believe in complete equality. So that was kind of nice as well. And they valued education. There were, yeah, interesting things about them. As you can imagine, this is not a very large group. Not a very large group. Okay. And I should have, goodness, I was thinking I should have seen if I had any statistics about numbers in here. I don't know if you can see the link that I just put up there. Oh, that's not the drawing where all the Shakers are ugly. Let's see. There's Ann Lee. Oh, I forgot to tell you that they were called Shakers because they shook when they prayed. So it was kind of a nickname for them, shaking Quakers. And when they moved to the United States, there were 9 of them. And I'm looking in this article and don't see that there are really too many numbers, how many people joined. There's more links in there in that article that it's linked to if you are interested in looking at those things. Okay. All right, let's see if that goes back to the, nope. All right, there are your faces again. I didn't mean to get rid of the notes there. As many Zoom meetings as I've had, you'd think I'd be better at this. All right, Oneida Colony. This thing's weird. There's so many weird things during this time period. Okay, Oneida Colony is easily the weirdest thing we're going to talk about today and could be all semester. All right, there's this guy, John Humphrey Noyes, who gets kicked out of Yale Theological Seminary because he starts to teach that the second coming of Christ has already come, and that now it's time to restructure the family unit. Now, many people believe they wanted to restructure the family unit because he also liked one of his co-pastor's wives and thought this would be a nice way to get to know her. However, I don't know that we have any direct evidence of this, but they did believe in something called complex marriage. It's very complex. Okay, so complex marriage is where all the men and all the women in the community are married to each other. So everyone in the community is married to each other. Now, this, of course, means that you can have activities that married people have with each other. Now, the way that they did this, very unique community, they typically scheduled these activities. So, like, you would have a schedule, and I'm not saying they scheduled the activities, they scheduled your time with different people in the community. So, like this month, the first 2 weeks, you're with Fred, and then the next 2 weeks, you're with Joe, that sort of thing. Or, opposite sex in this community. And you just kind of rotated through the entire community, which is sort of interesting. Usually when we talk about this, the young men go like, hey, sounds pretty good. And then young women go like, nope, not cool at all. I can ruin this for the guys, and I'm just about to. You ready? Okay. Because it's early in the era, their methods of birth control are not very many. So with the young guys, and usually people enter the community of adults around 14, which I know is pretty young. Remember, their life expectancy a little shorter. I'm not saying it's good to, become an adult in the community at age 14, but I'm just saying they did. So the method of birth control that they practiced was required a lot of, we'll say, self-control on the male part, so that they did not exchange any fluids. So until the guy could achieve that level of control, his partner, maybe for 6 months, would be an older woman. Before you get too excited, needs to be an older woman who is no longer capable of having children. Yeah, until they get the method of birth control down. If you're wondering why is it so important to get the method of birth control down, because they plan how many children their community has. They usually plan about 2 a year, and the community, they have a committee, it's a weird group, and they decide who's going to have the kid. And they decide by a combination of like who's really healthy, who's really nice looking, and who's really intelligent. So if you're 3 for 3, you could be in the list of people they might choose to have the baby for the community. And apparently they also rotated the baby around too, so everybody got a chance to take care of the baby. So the kids really were community kids as well. It's a very strange group. The people who ran the Oneida Colony didn't always live in the Oneida Colony, but they did profit from it. And you're wondering, like, how do they profit from it? Well, somebody's got to make stuff for the Oneida Colony to survive. So what they made was silverware and china. So if you have Oneida silverware or Oneida plates and cups and stuff at your house, it's pretty common. That's from their original community. It seems to me, I know I didn't put the details in this, excuse me, either, but it seems like this community lasted for 40 to 50 years, and they suspended, I was trying to think of the word, they suspended complex marriage a couple of times because people needed a break from it. And I think there's a point at which people go like, yeah, I really like this person, I'd like to spend some time with them, not everyone else in the community. So I think sometimes people needed a break from it. But their thought was similar to the thought of the Shakers, that inequality between men and women really came because of children. They just solved the problem in a different way. They said everybody's married to everyone. The community will decide who's having the children, and then the community will participate equally in taking care of those children, so the children are not a huge burden on just their parents. Interesting, isn't it? And I think the reason this community survived for longer than probably it makes sense is because it was really prosperous as well. Yeah. So, or there could be other reasons. You may speculate however you like. All right. Do you have any questions to this point? Is there anything you'd like to ask? Okay. I will assume that you're just taking this all in. All right. So utopian communities that are not religious also developed during this time period as well. And utopian, they're trying to create a utopian ideal society or community here on Earth. Some of these are more secular. They tend to be based on communal ownership, what you might consider communalism or socialism, perhaps to a certain extent, where everybody works together, everybody shares equally in the profits of the community. Profits, P-R-O-F-I-T-S, not, guys who predict the future or speak religious truth. All right, now, these three communities are pretty commonly mentioned during this era when people talk about this era. This Fourier group, in the United States, there's really nothing like super weird or gross about them. I only mention that because if you do any research on this Fourier guy is a weird dude. He's from France. That doesn't make him a weird dude. That's just incidental. And he believes that love has no age limit. So that and really no boundaries by sex. And I know that idea is fairly common, but the no age limit, he's the original love is love guy, but when he means love is love, he also means adults and kids. So I don't know anybody who thinks that's cool, but yeah, he wrote quite a bit about that, and apparently his communities in France practiced especially the man-boy love sort of thing. But in the United States, they're strictly socialist communities. I've not ever read anything that suggests that they restructure families or say, old dudes can marry 5-year-old boys. I don't think there's any of that goes on in the United States. But strictly a socialist kind of community. You see the same with Brook Farm and New Harmony, but their leaders are different. So in these communities, Fourier is based on the writings of this Charles Fourier, the French guy, with the exception apparently of the man-boy thing. Brook Farm is kind of the Kardashian style community. It's where the celebrities go. I don't know that people go over and visit the Kardashians. Sorry for stretching. But it's where maybe it's like, what is that crud? What is that religion that all celebrities were really trendy with for a while? Tom Cruise did it, and I don't know. Scientology, thank you very much. It's a little early for me, isn't it? So maybe Brook Farm was kind of the Scientology of the day. But some famous writers and poets and people went and lived temporarily at Brook Farm, which was in Massachusetts. And because it was a little bit of a celebrity community, they also did tours and raised money there. What to me was interesting about Brook Farm, it lasted like 4 or 5 years. And then there was some sort of accidental fire and it burned down. Now they had insurance, which I think had to have been peculiar for the time period, but they fought over the insurance settlement. So I'm thinking this is sort of a group of pacifist writer, actor, artist kind of people who talk about peace and love, and then when they get an insurance settlement, they fight over it and their community breaks up. But money, it kind of messes with us sometimes. And New Harmony, this is a traditional socialist community started by a fellow named Robert Owen, who is an industrialist from Scotland. He earns a ridiculous amount of money in Scotland. And and decides at that point, you know what, it'd be nice if other people had a lot of money as well, or at least enough to live on. And I guess was distressed by urban poverty. So New Harmony is in Indiana, which is even to this day not very urban except for Indianapolis. Maybe there's some other cities that are large in Indiana that I'm unaware of, but New Harmony is a really small community in Indiana, and it's a farming community, and they're socialist, and that lasts until they run out of Robert Owen's money, which takes about 10 years. He doesn't give them all his money. He set aside a certain amount, but it wasn't as profitable as they hoped, and it didn't become self-sustaining. Brook Farm was fairly self-sustaining. The Fourier groups tended to be, but they had an average lifespan of about 5 years. I think the problem pretty consistently with these communal colonies is probably the problem that you have with group projects. Group projects are great when everybody in the group does their work. Now, I don't know how many group projects you've been in where everyone in the group did their work. I'm trying to think, and it was approximately none for me. There's always that one person that's like, I'll just, ride the coattails, or that one type A person that's like, none of these people are smart as me. I want to do it all myself. So it's really hard to get everybody to, there's none of this equal work kind of thing, because I guess we're all a little different. And I think when you have a larger version of that community, after a while, probably everyone except the guy at the bottom that's riding the coattails, probably everybody else gets tired of everyone else. The type A people, it's like, they always feel like they're doing all the work and they have the best ideas, and no one else really contributes the way they do. The people in the middle, who honestly probably are doing most of the work, feel like they're doing most of the work but getting none of the credit, and the annoying smart guys at the top, or think they're smart guys at the top, just complain all the time, and then the coattail riders at the bottom just, ride the coattails. The coattail riders, I think they tend to like this, but that is my really generic, I was raised in the United States assessment of communal groups. Probably works pretty well in Texas as well. But these are decidedly secular, so they don't get together for religious reasons. Pretty trendy for a decade, or two. Where my little statement in the notes where it says their reputations were harmed by some unusual beliefs, that would be the Fourier group in particular. Larger issues, probably economic, based on communalism, economically on private property ownership, and profit. So if the idea is everybody owns private property, but you work together on a group piece of land or something like that, it doesn't always work. And people being asked to give up their private property for the benefit of the group is not a terribly comfortable situation for a lot of the people within the group. So, and also, sometimes people's ideas and work bring more profit than other people's ideas and work. And it's hard to believe that everyone's contribution is equal when you feel like your contribution is the reason the community made so much money. So earnings will decline. Communities typically last 3 to 4 years. These tend to be pretty brief. Some of the Fourier communities, like I mentioned, did last 20 to 25 years. And I think too, if you get the right people together with the right agreement and the right give and take, probably could work. But you really have to plan ahead and be very particular about who you chose, which probably isn't the general idea of communalism or socialism, is it? All right, a few more things. Dorothea Dix, and she'll probably be the last person we talk about before class ends. So Dorothea Dix, as a social reformer from this time period, who wanted to reform prisons and asylums. And prisons and asylums were really created to punish people during this time period, and their treatment was pretty harsh and inhumane. Dorothea Dix said that putting people in these facilities, if the state does this, the state has a responsibility to try to be humane to the people in these communities or in these facilities and try to help them achieve some reform. So she writes about, worked in some of these, consulted in some of these, and writes about people being beaten, people not being fed, people being left outdoors in the elements, in the bad weather, that sort of thing. And even in asylums, they would sometimes just warehouse people, and people would harm each other, beat each other, sexually assault each other. And it was especially true if people were mentally unstable. And they usually were not given medical care. They really were just warehoused. The idea was not to help these folks or reform these folks in the instance of prisoners, but to just get them away from society so they no longer harmed the rest of society. But if you warehouse them all together, and there are different varieties of people who are in these places for different reasons, then the more aggressive ones will harm the less aggressive ones, that sort of thing. So she thought they should be separated, protected, that sort of stuff. I think the protected part, people will go like, yeah, that makes sense. As time goes along, not immediately, but as time goes along, the separated part, people think, she probably overdid that a little bit. All right, so many of her suggestions were followed in certain states that had more state taxes, to be honest. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And a couple of these have religious backgrounds in their founding. So they tended to want to be more humane to people no matter what their situation. So I think some of the reason that sort of reform works in a certain 2 or 3 states is because those certain 2 or 3 states have certain traditions that tend to go throughout their history, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania being Puritan and then Quaker. And then Illinois, you'll see a lot of reform in Illinois around the Chicago area. She also suggested that criminals be kept in isolation and mentally ill people be kept in isolation so they could have periods of reflection, so they could ask themselves, why did I do that? How did my behavior harm or help society? What could I do differently? And she really thought self-reflection was the way to achieve change. And I think self-reflection for most of us is quite useful. But they achieved that, especially in the eastern states. Pennsylvania is the eastern state prison, which somebody told me, I was talking about this in class one time, and somebody said, yeah, I lived near there when I was a kid. We had a birthday party there. So apparently you could rent it out for a birthday party now. I know it's more of a museum and you can tour it now, but it's sort of shaped like a spider, where there's a big central area that's a circle, and then it has little legs that go off to the side of it. And the little legs are individual cells, and people were kept in these individual cells pretty much all the time. And they had a little closed part, and then they had an open courtyard, but it was really small. So you could just walk like, 6 or 8 feet in a circle, but that was so you could get exercise and fresh air, that sort of stuff. But they fed you through the door. You really didn't come out very often. And their thought was you would be safe and have time for reflection. Of course, in the modern era, we know, and maybe COVID has cemented this idea for us, isolation is not good for your mental health. So especially, it really didn't matter if it was in a prison or if it was in a mental health institution, the long-term consequences of too much isolation, pretty rough. And the book mentions instability and suicide. Yeah, so, the idea that self-reflection is good for you, of course, is an important idea. Too much self-reflection, like, 6 or 8 years of self-reflection, probably not good for you. Now, she does lobby several different states. She lobbies nationally. And some of her ideas are adopted by certain states. One of the things that you'll notice is usually when a state adopts an idea, it's almost always a northern state rather than a southern state. And if you're wondering why, are you wondering why? Of course we are, with 5 minutes left in class. We are deeply engaged at this point. If you're wondering why reform and public school and stuff tends to happen in the North and not the South, it's because they tend to have more taxes so they can pay for these things. In the South, remember, you got like 5 plantation owners who run the entire state. I'm exaggerating only a little. And so they've got to decide, do we want to tax people? Well, they're the only ones who can afford to pay taxes. So they pretty much say, nah, let's not have too much tax. Because if we had tax, then we'd have to pay it, and then we might have to create a school system or something like that that would help people who were poorer, but we'd have to pay for it. So in cities or in states where they have more cities, where they're more likely to favor public education, that kind of stuff, they also collect more taxes as a rule. And the South kind of shies away from taxes because they would probably come just from plantations, and plantation owners ran everything, and they didn't really want to pay taxes. Plus, it's kind of in their best interest to make sure there's a whole group of really poor people that depend on them. They're not really looking for consumers because they're not really manufacturing a lot. They're growing cotton. In a system where you're looking for consumers, you want a middle class. So, if you're creating product, you want someone to buy that product. If you're growing cotton, people don't buy cotton. You know what I mean? Yeah. All right. I figure now is about time to stop. It's pretty close. All right. So before we go, I'm going to remind you of a couple of things. Ready? You listening? I know you are. If you're working on the weekly question, which we'll talk about in class next time, pages 450 to 456 in the textbook. Remember, you have to mention Theodore Weld's ideas, why immediate emancipation really matters. And we're going to talk about this pretty much the entire class next time, except for the brief period of time where we talk about feminism. But those two things kind of go together because there's a lot of women involved in the abolition movement. So I think it will all work out. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.